Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale uncovers profound lessons about love, resilience, and the human spirit. In today's story, an ordinary day at the playground takes an unexpected turn when a shocking accusation turns one man's life upside down. What begins as a simple act of kindness evolves into a battle for truth and integrity, challenging societal biases and revealing the strength of compassion and trust. Stay with us as we journey through this emotional rollercoaster and uncover the profound lessons hidden within. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories. Let's dive into today's story together. The sun hung low in the autumn sky, casting a warm golden hue over Central Park, painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson. Jake Harper adjusted his watch as he waited for his best friend, Ryan, to arrive. It had been years since they'd met, but their bond remained unshakable, grounded in shared history and mutual trust. When Ryan called earlier, his voice slightly rushed. Jake didn't hesitate to agree to his favor. Ryan had an urgent matter to attend to and needed someone he could rely on to watch his 7-year-old twin daughters, Emma and Olivia. Jake, ever dependable, was the obvious choice. The twins were a burst of energy the moment they arrived. Emma, the more adventurous of the two, immediately tugged Jake's hand toward the nearest playground structure. Olivia, quieter but equally spirited, followed close behind, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Ryan crouched down, giving his daughters quick hugs, then turned to Jake with a grateful smile. "I shouldn't be long," he said, his tone both apologetic and appreciative. Jake waved him off with a casual grin. "Go handle your business. We've got this." With Ryan gone, Jake found himself at the edge of the vibrant playground. The air was alive with children's laughter, the occasional bark of dogs, and the hum of conversations between parents. Emma and Olivia raced toward the swings, their giggles echoing in the crisp air. Jake settled onto a bench nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the girls as they played. It had been a while since he'd spent time like this, unstructured, serene, and far removed from the pressures of his corporate job. Watching the twins brought a sense of joy that felt almost foreign. Their laughter was infectious, their world uncomplicated and brimming with wonder. Jake found himself smiling as he sipped his coffee, marveling at how their simple delight could brighten his day. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Emma and Olivia took turns challenging each other to jump higher on the swings, then scurried off to the slide, where they created elaborate stories about being adventurers in a magical land. Jake watched, occasionally calling out encouragement, but mostly letting them lead their playful escapades. The park seemed to exist in a bubble of tranquility, where nothing could disrupt the flow of happiness. That was until the shadow fell across him. He looked up to find a woman standing before him, her expression a mix of skepticism and disdain. She was in her late 40s, with sharp features and a coat that screamed efficiency. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she looked at Jake as though she'd already made up her mind about him. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. "But what exactly are you doing here?" Jake blinked, caught off guard by the hostility in her voice. "I'm just watching the girls," he replied, gesturing toward Emma and Olivia, who were now giggling as they tried to climb the jungle gym. "Their dad had something to take care of, so I'm keeping an eye on them." The woman didn't even glance toward the girls. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. "And who are you to them?" she demanded. Jake sighed, realizing this wasn't going to be a casual exchange. "I'm their dad's best friend," he said, his tone calm but firm. "We've known each other for years. He asked me to watch them for a bit." Her eyebrows shot up in an almost theatrical expression of disbelief. "A grown man sitting alone in a park watching two little girls," she said, her voice rising slightly. "That's suspicious, don't you think?" Jake felt his patience begin to fray. "I'm just here to look after them, that's all." But the woman wasn't having it. She took a step closer, her gaze accusing. Men like you always have an excuse, she snapped. I've seen it before. Pretending to be harmless when really she didn't finish the sentence. But her implication hung heavy in the air. Jake's stomach churned. He stood slowly, keeping his posture non-threatening but firm. I don't know what you think you're seeing, but I assure you, you're mistaken. Those girls are perfectly safe. They know me. And they trust me. Trust you, she scoffed. Her tone dripping with disdain. How convenient. I'm calling the police. Jake's heart sank. That's completely unnecessary, he said. His voice steady but tinged with frustration. You're misunderstanding the situation. But the woman was already pulling out her phone. Her movements swift and determined. Around them, the lively buzz of the park began to quiet as other parents noticed the confrontation. Jake could feel their eyes on him. A mix of curiosity and concern. And it made his skin crawl. He glanced toward Emma and Olivia, who were blissfully unaware of the tension brewing nearby. The last thing he wanted was for them to sense that something was wrong. Hello. Yes, the woman began, speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. I'm at the playground in Central Park. And there's a suspicious man here watching two little girls. I don't believe his story. Please send someone quickly. Jake closed his eyes, willing himself to stay calm. He clenched his fists at his sides, his mind racing for a way to de-escalate the situation. But there was no reasoning with someone who had already decided he was guilty of something terrible. All he could do now was wait and hope the truth would prevail. He sat back down on the bench, his chest tight with anxiety. Parents nearby began whispering among themselves, their gazes shifting between Jake and the woman. Some looked sympathetic, others wary. Jake felt the weight of their judgments pressing down on him like a physical force. When the distant wail of sirens reached his ears, Jake felt his stomach drop. The world that had seemed so peaceful just moments ago now felt cold and hostile. All he could do was brace himself for what was to come, hoping against hope that Ryan would arrive in time to set things right. But as the police car pulled up to the curb and two officers stepped out, Jake knew this was just the beginning of a much larger ordeal. The playground, once a haven of laughter and innocence, now felt heavy with tension. Parents nearby were whispering among themselves, their conversations laced with suspicion as they cast furtive glances at Jake. Emma and Olivia, still engrossed in their carefree play on the jungle gym, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. Jake sat rigidly on the bench, his hands resting on his knees in plain sight. A silent statement of non-aggression. He wasn't sure if the gesture mattered. Most of the onlookers had already made up their minds. Across from him, the woman paced, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. She was speaking loudly, emphasizing words like suspicious and children, her tone making it clear she wasn't about to back down. When the police car finally arrived, the playground seemed to collectively hold its breath. The two officers who stepped out appeared calm but alert, their eyes scanning the scene before focusing on the woman, who immediately rushed toward them, waving her arms dramatically. "Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with a mixture of indignation and triumph. "That man over there," she gestured toward Jake with a pointed finger, "has been sitting here alone, watching those two girls. He claims he knows them. But I don't believe him. He's dangerous, I'm sure of it." The officers exchanged a brief glance before one of them walked over to Jake. The other remained with the woman, listening as she recounted her version of events with increasing fervor. Jake stood slowly as the officer approached, keeping his movements deliberate and his posture non-threatening. "Sir," the officer began, his tone neutral but firm. "Can I have your name?" "Jake Harper," he replied, his voice steady despite the unease tightening in his chest. "And I'd like to clear this up as quickly as possible." The officer nodded, taking out a small notebook. "Can you tell me your relationship to the girls?" "They're my best friend's daughters," Jake explained, glancing toward Emma and Olivia. "He had an urgent errand to run and asked me to watch them for a little while. I've known them since they were born. I'm like an uncle to them. The officer's gaze flicked toward the girls, who were now sitting on the edge of the jungle gym. Watching curiously, the officer motioned for his partner, who approached the girls with a warm smile, crouching down to speak with them. Jake felt a pang of hope as he watched the interaction. Emma and Olivia would tell the truth. He was certain of that. But the woman wasn't done. She stepped closer to the first officer, her voice rising in pitch. Of course. They'll say they know him. He probably threatened them to stay quiet. You can't trust what they say. This man is dangerous. Jake clenched his jaw, his frustration threatening to bubble over. He said evenly, addressing her directly. You don't know me. You've made an assumption based on nothing but your own prejudice. And you've turned an innocent situation into a spectacle. Prejudice, she scoffed, her eyes narrowing. I'm protecting those girls from someone who doesn't belong here. Men like you always have excuses. It's disgusting. Jake's patience wore thin. But before he could respond, the second officer returned. The girls say they know him, he reported, glancing between his partner and Jake. They call him Uncle Jake and mentioned that their dad asked him to watch them. They seem completely at ease. Relief washed over Jake. But it was short-lived. The woman's face twisted with disbelief. They're lying, she cried. Or he's coached them to say that. You have to do more, you can't just let him go. The lead officer's expression hardened slightly, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. He said firmly, we've spoken to the children. And they've confirmed they know this man. Unless you have concrete evidence to support your claims, we can't take this any further. The woman's mouth opened, then closed again, as though searching for a counter-argument. Finally, she pointed a trembling finger at Jake. You're making a mistake, she hissed. You'll see. Men like him don't stop until it's too late. Jake took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Officer, he said, turning back to the lead officer. I can call their father. He'll confirm everything I've told you. The officer nodded. Please do. Jake pulled out his phone, dialing Ryan's number with trembling fingers. The sound of the ringing felt like an eternity. But when Ryan's familiar voice answered, Jake nearly sagged with relief. Hey, Jake. Ryan said. Everything okay? Ryan. Jake began, his voice steady but urgent. I need you to come to the park. There's been a misunderstanding. And the police need to speak with you. What? Ryan's voice sharpened with concern. What's going on? Are the girls okay? They're fine. Jake assured him. But I need you here now. Please. I'm on my way, Ryan said without hesitation. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Jake hung up and turned to the officers. He's on his way, he said, his tone resolute. He'll clear this up. The lead officer nodded, his expression softening slightly. But the woman wasn't ready to concede. She crossed her arms, glaring at Jake with unrelenting disdain. We'll see about that, she muttered, her voice dripping with venom. Jake sat back down on the bench, his mind racing as he waited. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. He glanced at Emma and Olivia, who were now watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, their usual cheer replaced by confusion. He gave them a small wave, hoping to reassure them, but his heart ached knowing they were witnessing this. Finally, Ryan appeared, jogging into the playground, his face a mixture of alarm and determination. Jake stood, relief washing over him as Ryan approached. Officers. Ryan began, his voice firm. I'm Ryan Miller. And those are my daughters. Jake is my best friend. And I asked him to watch them while I ran an errand. What's going on here? The lead officer glanced at Jake, then back at Ryan. Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller. We've been dealing with a complaint, but your confirmation clears everything up. Ryan turned to the woman, his eyes blazing with controlled anger. You accused my best friend of what? Exactly? Watching my daughters while I asked him to? You've humiliated him and scared my kids. What gives you the right? The woman faltered, her confidence visibly shaken for the first time. I was just trying to protect them, she stammered. But Ryan cut her off. You weren't protecting anyone, he snapped. You were projecting your own fears onto a good man doing a favor for a friend. You should be ashamed of yourself. The woman's face flushed, and she turned away, her muttering barely audible as she walked off. Jake exhaled, the weight of the ordeal finally beginning to lift. For the first time in what felt like hours, the park began to return to its normal rhythm. Ryan placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. I'm sorry you had to go through that, he said quietly. You didn't deserve it. Jake shook his head, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Let's just get the girls and go home. And with that, the four of them left the park together, leaving behind the chaos and accusations, but not the memory of what had transpired. As they left the park, Ryan held Emma and Olivia's hands tightly, his jaw set with a mix of anger and guilt. Jake walked a few steps behind, his shoulders slouched under the weight of what had just unfolded. The girls' chatter slowly returned, though it was subdued, their usual effervescence dulled by the tension they had just witnessed. Ryan led them toward his car, pausing only to check on Jake. You sure you're okay? He asked, his voice low so the girls wouldn't overhear. Jake nodded, though his expression betrayed the effort it took to keep himself together. I'll be fine, he said, his voice quiet. Let's just get them home. Ryan nodded, not pressing further, and ushered the girls into the car. Emma turned to Jake before climbing in. Uncle Jake, are you coming with us? She asked, her big brown eyes searching his face. Jake forced a smile, crouching down to meet her gaze. Not today, sweetheart. But I'll see you soon. Okay. Emma hesitated, then wrapped her small arms around his neck. You're the best uncle ever, she whispered. Jake swallowed hard, hugging her back. When she finally climbed into the car, he stood and waved them off as Ryan drove away. Jake stood in the parking lot for a long moment, watching the car disappear into the distance. The events of the afternoon replayed in his mind like a broken record. Every glare, every accusation, every whisper from the onlookers, it all clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake. Deciding he needed time to clear his head, he began walking. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The city was beginning to wind down, and the usual hum of evening activity served as a small distraction from his thoughts. Jake eventually found himself in a small park on the other side of town, far removed from the chaos of earlier. The park was peaceful, its paths lined with trees whose leaves rustled gently in the breeze. A few joggers passed by, and an older couple sat on a bench, their hands entwined as they watched the ducks in the pond. Jake sat down on an empty bench, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. He felt drained, as though the woman's accusations had taken something from him he couldn't get back. It wasn't just the humiliation, though that had been bad enough. It was the way she had looked at him, as if he were something vile, something unworthy of trust or decency. It was the judgment in the eyes of the crowd, the whispers he couldn't unhear. For someone like Jake, who had always tried to live with integrity and kindness, it felt like a personal wound. His thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He looked up to see an older man approaching, his face weathered but kind. The man gestured to the bench. Mind if I sit? Jake shook his head, offering a small smile. Go ahead. The man sat, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. Jake found himself oddly comforted by the man's quiet presence. Eventually, the man broke the silence. Rough day? He asked, his voice calm and steady. Jake let out a hollow laugh. You could say that. The man nodded, as though he understood more than Jake had said. People can be cruel, he said after a moment. They see what they want to see, and once they've made up their minds, it's hard to convince them otherwise. Jake looked at him, surprised by the accuracy of his words. "That's exactly what happened today," he admitted. "Someone accused me of something terrible. Something I would never do. Just because she assumed the worst about me." The man nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "It's not fair," he said simply. "But you can't let it define you. You're more than their assumptions. More than their ignorance. Don't let them take that away from you." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat at the man's words. He had been so consumed by the injustice of what had happened that he hadn't allowed himself to think beyond it. Hearing the man's calm, assured tone was like a lifeline. "Thanks," Jake said quietly. "I needed to hear that." The man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Take care of yourself," he said, standing up and walking away, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts once more. Jake stayed on the bench for a while longer, staring at the pond as the sun dipped below the horizon. The man's words echoed in his mind, slowly easing the weight on his chest. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt like he could breathe a little easier. When he finally stood to leave, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the streets. Jake made his way home, the exhaustion in his body now matched by a sense of quiet determination. He wasn't sure how he would move forward from this. But he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let the woman's prejudice define him. The next morning, Jake woke up with a lingering heaviness. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind. The accusations, the stares, and the overwhelming helplessness he'd felt. Yet, the older man's words from the park resonated, offering a small semblance of clarity. Jake had resolved not to let the woman's baseless accusations define him. But the path forward still felt uncertain. As he sipped his morning coffee, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Ryan. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," Jake said, his voice subdued. "Jake." Ryan's tone was serious, but there was an undertone of guilt. "How are you holding up?" Jake took a deep breath. "I'm okay. Yesterday, it was rough. But I'll get through it." Ryan sighed audibly. "I can't stop thinking about it. What that woman did. The way she treated you, it wasn't just unfair. It was cruel. And the girls, they were so confused by the whole thing. It's been on my mind all night." Jake didn't know how to respond. He appreciated Ryan's concern, but he didn't want to dwell on the ugliness of the experience. "It's over now," Jake said, trying to sound optimistic. "The police cleared everything up. Let's just move on." But Ryan wasn't ready to drop it. "I've been thinking," he said. "I don't think we should let this slide. She put you through hell for no reason. Jake. People like that need to be held accountable." Jake frowned, leaning against the counter. "What are you suggesting?" "File a report," Ryan said. "She made false accusations and created a public spectacle. That's not okay. Jake. If she gets away with it, what's stopping her from doing the same thing to someone else?" Jake's initial instinct was to resist. The idea of filing a report, of revisiting the humiliation in any formal capacity, made his stomach turn. But Ryan's point was valid. If nothing was done, this woman could go on to harass someone else, potentially causing even more damage. "I don't know, Ryan," Jake said after a long pause. "I just want to put this behind me." "I get it," Ryan said, his tone softening. "But think about it. You don't have to decide now. But I'll support you if you do." They spoke for a few more minutes before hanging up, and Jake was left alone with his thoughts. Filing a report felt daunting, but Ryan's words had planted a seed. He spent the rest of the morning trying to distract himself, but the memory of the woman's accusations lingered. Later that day, Jake decided to take a walk to clear his head. He meandered through the city streets, the crisp air helping to lift his spirits. As he passed by a playground, not the one from the day before, but another, quieter one, he noticed a group of children playing. Their laughter reminded him of Emma and Olivia, and he couldn't help but smile. But the joy was fleeting. replaced by the memory of the crowd's judgmental stares. Jake clenched his fists, frustrated that one woman's words had such a lasting impact on him. He wanted to shake it off, to move forward, but it felt like a weight he couldn't quite shed. By the time he returned home, Jake had made up his mind. Filing a report wasn't just about him, it was about making sure this kind of behavior didn't go unchecked. He picked up his phone and called Ryan. "I'll do it," Jake said when Ryan answered. "I'll file the report." Ryan's relief was palpable. "Good. I'll go with you. You don't have to do this alone." The next morning, Jake and Ryan arrived at the police station. The sterile environment and the low hum of activity immediately set Jake on edge. He wasn't used to being in places like this, and the thought of reliving the ordeal made his stomach churn. But Ryan's presence was steadying. At the front desk, a young officer greeted them. "How can I help you?" Jake hesitated, but Ryan nudged him forward. "I'd like to file a report," Jake said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "It's about an incident that happened at the playground yesterday." The officer nodded, pulling out a form. "Take your time," she said kindly. "We'll make sure everything is documented." Jake recounted the events of the previous day, doing his best to remain calm as he described the woman's accusations, the crowd's reaction, and the eventual arrival of the police. As he spoke, he felt the weight of the incident pressing down on him again. But Ryan's supportive presence kept him grounded. When Jake finished, the officer thanked him. "We take false accusations seriously," she said. "We'll follow up on this and keep you updated." As they left the station, Ryan clapped Jake on the shoulder. "You did the right thing, man." Jake nodded, though he still felt a mix of emotions. Filing the report didn't erase what had happened, but it felt like a step toward reclaiming some control. Over the next few days, Jake tried to focus on moving forward. He spent time with Ryan and the girls, finding comfort in their unshakable trust in him. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Emma spoke up. "Uncle Jake," she said, her voice serious for a 7-year-old. "Why was that lady so mean to you?" Jake hesitated, unsure of how to explain it in a way she would understand. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people make assumptions about others without knowing the whole story. It's not right. But it happens." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I think you're the best uncle ever," she said with a firm nod. As if that settled the matter. Jake smiled, her words lifting his spirits more than she could possibly know. It was moments like these that reminded him of what truly mattered. The opinions of strangers, the weight of false accusations, none of it could overshadow the genuine love and trust he had with those who knew him best. In the days that followed, life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy for Jake. He returned to his usual routine, balancing work with visits to Ryan and the girls. Despite the steady rhythm of his days, the incident at the playground lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't just the woman's accusations that stayed with him, it was the way the crowd had so readily believed her. The way judgment had turned into a spectacle. The police had contacted Jake to inform him that the woman was issued a warning for her actions. While it didn't feel like full justice, it was a small validation that what he had endured wasn't without consequence. Still, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the experience had changed him. He found himself more aware of how quickly perceptions could spiral out of control. And he couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced similar treatment. One afternoon, as Jake was walking back from the local grocery store, he bumped into an older man who looked vaguely familiar. It took a moment for Jake to recognize him. It was the same man from the quiet park. The one who had offered him words of wisdom on that difficult day. "Jake." "Right," the man said with a warm smile. Jake blinked in surprise. "Yes. I didn't think you'd remember me." The man chuckled. "Hard to forget someone who looked so lost that day. You doing better now?" Jake nodded. "Yeah. It's been a lot. But I think I'm getting there. Your words helped more than I realized at the time." The man's smile widened. "Glad to hear it. Life throws curveballs. son. But it's how we handle them that matters. You looked like you had the strength to pull through. And I'm glad I wasn't wrong. Jake felt a flicker of gratitude. There was something comforting about the man's presence. A steadiness that made Jake feel seen. Thank you, he said sincerely. It means a lot. The man gave him a knowing look. You've got people in your corner. Don't forget that. And don't let the voices of those who don't matter drown out the ones that do. Jake nodded. The man's words resonating deeply. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before parting ways. And Jake continued his walk home with a lighter heart. Later that evening, Jake was at Ryan's house for dinner. The girls had insisted he stay for a movie night. And Jake couldn't resist their enthusiasm. As they sat around the table, the conversation inevitably turned to the playground incident. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what happened. And it still bothers me how quickly everyone judged you. It's like they didn't even stop to consider that they might be wrong. Jake sighed, setting down his fork. People are quick to assume the worst. I guess it's easier to react than to think things through. But I've decided not to dwell on it. What matters is that you and the girls know the truth. Ryan nodded. But he still looked troubled. I just hate that you had to go through that. And that the girls saw it happen. It's not something they should have to understand at their age. Emma, ever the curious one, chimed in. Is it because people don't trust strangers? Jake hesitated, unsure of how to explain the complexities of prejudice to a 7-year-old. Sometimes, he said carefully, people are scared of what they don't understand. And that fear can make them jump to conclusions. Emma frowned, her small brow furrowing in thought. That's not fair. No, Jake agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's not. After dinner, the girls eagerly set up their blankets and pillows in the living room for movie night. As they settled in, Jake found himself watching them with a mix of fondness and protectiveness. Their innocence was a reminder of what he wanted to preserve. Not just for them but for himself. He didn't want the bitterness of the incident to overshadow the joy he found in moments like this. The movie played. A light-hearted animated film that had the girls laughing and Jake smiling despite himself. For a while, the weight of everything lifted, replaced by the warmth of being surrounded by love and trust. Ryan caught Jake's eye and gave him a reassuring nod. A silent reminder that he wasn't alone in facing whatever came next. As the credits rolled and the girls began to doze off, Ryan turned to Jake. You know, despite everything, I think you handled it better than most people would have. Staying calm, waiting for me to come back, it couldn't have been easy. Jake shrugged. It wasn't. But losing my cool wouldn't have helped. I just kept thinking about the girls. They didn't need to see me falling apart. Ryan smiled faintly. You're a good man, Jake. I hope you know that. Jake didn't respond right away. He glanced at the sleeping girls, their faces peaceful, and felt a surge of resolve. I'm just trying to be the kind of person they can trust. That's what matters to me. Ryan nodded, and they fell into a comfortable silence. In that moment, Jake realized that while the incident at the playground had shaken him, it hadn't broken him. It had reminded him of the importance of staying true to who he was, no matter how others might perceive him. And as he sat there surrounded by the people who believed in him, Jake knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The days that followed were a mix of introspection and cautious optimism for Jake. The incident at the playground had left an indelible mark on his perception of the world. But it also brought unexpected clarity. He began to recognize the value of the relationships he had cultivated, the people who truly mattered and saw him for who he was. One Saturday morning, Jake found himself back at the park. This time with Ryan and the girls. The crisp air carried the sounds of children laughing and the rustling of leaves. A stark contrast to the tension that had enveloped the space during his last visit. Today, the park felt lighter, more welcoming, as if it was offering him a chance to rewrite the narrative of that place. Jake, watch me, Sophie called out as she climbed the jungle gym with determined focus. Jake smiled and waved. I'm watching. Sophie, you've got this. Ryan stood beside him, sipping his coffee and observing the scene with a contented expression. They've been looking forward to this all week. Especially since you said you'd come. Jake chuckled. They're easy to impress. I just have to show up. Ryan shook his head. It's more than that. Jake. They trust you. That's not something they give to just anyone. Jake felt a warmth in Ryan's words but didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched as Sophie reached the top of the jungle gym, her face lighting up with pride. Moments like this reminded him of why he had stayed calm during the playground ordeal, because their innocence, their joy, was worth protecting. As the morning wore on, Jake and Ryan found a bench to sit on while the girls played with new friends they had made. The park was buzzing with activity, a tapestry of families and laughter. Jake noticed a woman sitting a few benches away, watching her child with a peaceful expression. She glanced his way briefly and gave a polite nod, her gaze holding none of the suspicion he had faced before. Ryan followed Jake's line of sight and smirked. See, not everyone's out to make assumptions about you. Jake shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe not. But I can't unsee how quickly things can escalate. It's made me more aware. Ryan set his coffee cup down, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've been thinking about what you said that night. How people jump to conclusions because they're scared or don't understand. It's true. But it's also exhausting. I don't want my daughters growing up in a world where people make those kinds of snap judgments. Jake leaned back on the bench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Me neither. But it's not just about protecting them. It's about teaching them to be better than that. To ask questions. To give people the benefit of the doubt. Ryan nodded, his expression softening. You're good at that. You know, being patient, staying calm. I've always admired that about you. Jake let out a soft laugh. It's not easy. But if I lose my head, what message does that send? The world's full of enough chaos. Someone's got to keep it steady. Their conversation was interrupted by Lily and Sophie running toward them, their faces flushed with excitement. Dad. Jake. Lily exclaimed, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. We made drawings. Jake took the paper she handed him and unfolded it carefully. The drawing was a colorful depiction of the four of them, Ryan, the girls, and himself standing together in the park, smiling. Max the dog was there too, his tail wagging happily. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat as he studied the drawing. It was simple, childlike, but it spoke volumes. It showed how the girls saw him, as part of their family, as someone they could count on. This is amazing. Lily. Jake said, his voice warm. You're quite the artist. Lily beamed. And Sophie chimed in. We wanted to make sure Max looked just like himself. Ryan leaned over to look at the drawing, his smile widening. You girls did a great job. This is going on the fridge when we get home. The girls cheered, their excitement infectious. As they ran back toward the swings, Jake folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He knew he would keep it, a tangible reminder of what truly mattered. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the park, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. The incident at the playground might have shaken him, but it hadn't defined him. The people who mattered, the ones who knew him, were his anchor. Ryan clapped him on the shoulder as they gathered their things to leave. Thanks for coming today. It means a lot to them. And to me. Jake nodded, his smile genuine. I wouldn't miss it. As they walked back to the car, Jake thought about the stranger he had met in the park that evening. The one who had reminded him not to let assumptions define him. Those words had stuck with him, a guiding principle in the aftermath of everything. The memory of the woman's accusations might never fade completely, but it no longer held power over him. He had his friends, the girls' trust, and a clear understanding of who he was. And in the grand scheme of things, that was enough. When they reached the car, Sophie handed Jake another drawing, a small one this time, of just him and Maximum. "This is for you. So you don't forget us," she said with a shy smile. Jake crouched to her level, his eyes kind. "I couldn't forget you too, even if I tried." "Thank you, Sophie. This means a lot." As the car pulled away, Jake stood there for a moment, holding the drawing in his hand. The sun set behind him, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt whole. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was wide open, and he was ready to face it, one step at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake stood at the edge of the park, watching the silhouettes of Ryan and the girls fade into the distance. The crisp evening air carried with it a quiet sense of closure. The past few weeks had tested him, forcing him to confront assumptions, prejudices, and his own strength of character. Through it all, he had learned that the people who truly matter will see you for who you are, even when the world tries to paint you differently. The drawings Sophie and Lily had given him rested safely in his pocket, symbols of trust, love, and the bonds they shared. Jake smiled to himself, feeling lighter than he had in days. The incident that had threatened to shake his foundation had, in an unexpected way, reinforced what was most important: the relationships that defined him, the family he had built, and the unwavering belief in doing what was right. As Jake turned to head home, he thought about the road ahead, filled with challenges, but also hope. Life, he realized, isn't about perfection, it's about resilience, love, and the connections that keep us grounded. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt tales. See you in the next video.